In 1856, in the blood-red clay country of Georgia, a house built on silence became the stage for a revenge so intimate, it was swallowed one mouthful at a time. The structure itself was a lie, a grand statement of permanence built by hands that would never be recorded in its history. Its whitewashed columns gleamed under a punishing sun, pretending at an order that was as fragile as a pane of glass. This house, like so many others of its time, was a living, breathing organism, and its lifeblood was the silent, ceaseless labor of the unseen. Its wealth was drawn from the cotton fields, tilled by the enslaved, but its daily survival, its very breath came from the kitchen. This kitchen was set apart from the main house, a deliberate architectural choice to keep the smoke, the sweat, and the truth of the labor from staining the pristine air of the masters. But in doing so, they created a separate kingdom. A domain of fire, steam, and shadow, ruled by a woman whose name was deemed unworthy of the family ledger. She was the hearth keeper, the bread maker, the silent engine of their comfort. Her existence was a paradox. She was everywhere and nowhere. Her hands shaped the dough that would sit at the center of their table. Her presence was in every sip of water, every spoonful of stew, yet to them, she was less than a ghost. A function, not a person. And this, you see, is where the story truly begins. Not with a scream, but with a silence so profound it could curdle milk. They built their world on the assumption that invisibility meant powerlessness. They believed that a downcast eye signified a defeated spirit. They were wrong. For in that sweltering kitchen, in the heart of that enforced silence, a plan was taking root. A reckoning was being kneaded into the daily bread. The very nourishment they demanded, the sustenance they took for granted, would become the instrument of their agonizing, meticulously slow, and brutally personal destruction. They could not imagine it. They couldn't conceive that the hands that fed them could also be the hands that would patiently, methodically, tear them apart from the inside out. Her world was defined by a four-walled room, thick with the smell of wood smoke and rendered fat. She rose before the sun had even thought to burn the mist from the fields, her first act to coax a flame from the embers of the night before. This fire was her constant companion, a hungry mouth she had to feed, a relentless heart she had to tend. The family upstairs slept in canopied beds, their dreams cushioned by imported linens, while she stood on a floor of packed earth, her reality circumscribed by the clang of iron pots and the rhythmic thud of a knife on a worn wooden board. Can you imagine that? To have your entire existence measured in the meals you prepare for others. Her hands were never truly clean. They were perpetually dusted with flour, stained with berry juice, or scalded from the steam of a boiling kettle. These were the hands that touched everything the family would consume. They washed the vegetables, salted the meats, and most importantly, they shaped the bread. Bread was the cornerstone of their table, a symbol of their stability, their prosperity, their God-given right to be fed. It arrived at the dining room warm, whole, and perfect, as if it had simply willed itself into existence. They never considered the journey it had taken. They never imagined the quiet thoughts of the woman who needed their sustenance, her knuckles pressing into the dough, her gaze fixed on the rising sun through a grimy pane of glass. To them, she was a tool, an extension of the hearth itself. Her silence was not seen as a choice, but as a natural state of being, like the quiet of a plow horse waiting for its master. But invisibility grants a strange kind of power. To be unseen is to be unwatched. To be dismissed is to be underestimated. From her vantage point in the shadows, she saw everything. She knew who drank too much, who whispered secrets in the parlor, who treated the other servants with a casual cruelty that went unremarked. She heard the rhythms of their lives, the cadence of their footsteps on the stairs, the timbre of their laughter, a laughter she was never meant to share. And in this crucible of heat and silence, an idea began to form, an idea as sharp and as clear as a shard of broken glass. There is a chilling quote from the era, attributed to a physician who treated the wealthy planter class. He wrote, "The maladies of the gut are often but a reflection of a disordered spirit. The body turns upon itself when the soul is in turmoil." He meant it as a diagnosis of the patient. He never considered it could be a diagnosis of the entire system. He never imagined the turmoil wasn't in the soul of the one being served, but in the heart of the one who was serving. The turmoil that was about to be unleashed began without a sound. It started in the places no one looked: a discarded bottle behind the smokehouse, a broken window pane from a winter storm, its pieces swept into a corner and forgotten by everyone but her. She began to collect them. Small, jagged fragments held in the palm of her hand, they felt like solid secrets. In the quiet moments after the family had retired for the night, when the only sound was the crackle of the dying fire, she would work. Using the same stone mortar and pestle meant for grinding herbs and spices, she began to grind the glass. It was a slow, laborious process. The grating sound had to be masked by the chirping of crickets or the sigh of the wind. She ground it down, not all of it to dust, no. That was the art of it. Some of it became a fine, sand-like powder, almost indistinguishable from salt or stone-ground flour. But some pieces she left larger, like splinters of ice, small enough to be swallowed unnoticed, but large enough to do their work. She kept her collection in a small wooden box, hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the corner of her small sleeping quarters. It was her secret harvest. While the master tallied his profits from cotton, she tallied her growing supply of razor-sharp vengeance. This wasn't a crime of passion, a sudden, explosive act. It was a slow, creeping poison, administered with the patience of a spider weaving its web. She was composing a symphony of agony, and the first note was about to be played. The instrument would be their supper. The delivery system would be their trust. It began on an otherwise unremarkable evening. Supper was served as it always was: a heavy stew, salted pork, and a round, crusty loaf of bread placed at the center of the polished dining table. The master of the house, a man whose presence filled every room with an unshakable sense of authority, took the first slice of bread, as was his custom. He ate with a hearty appetite, speaking of crop yields and the price of cotton, his voice booming with the confidence of a man who believed the world was built to serve him. An hour later, the first tremor of the earthquake that would shatter his world made itself known. He pressed a hand to his abdomen, a sudden, sharp cramp twisting his insides. He dismissed it at first. A touch of indigestion, perhaps the pork was too rich. But this was different. This wasn't the dull ache of a sour stomach. This felt, as he would later describe to the doctor, like a hot poker being twisted in my gut. The pain came in waves, each one more intense than the last, leaving him pale and sweating. He retired early, leaning heavily on the banister as he climbed the stairs, his confident stride gone, replaced by the cautious shuffle of a man suddenly at war with his own body. The house fell into a hushed quiet. The servants exchanged nervous glances. Sickness was a constant fear, but the master's robust health had always seemed as permanent and unshakable as the brick foundation of the house itself. In the kitchen, the maid cleaned the dishes. She moved with the same deliberate, quiet grace as always. Her face was a mask of placid obedience. She scraped the leftover stew from the plates, her hands moving through the greasy water, her expression unreadable. She heard the master's low groans from the room above, a sound that traveled through the floorboards. To anyone watching, she was simply a servant finishing her nightly chores. But if you could have seen into her heart, you would have understood. She wasn't just hearing a sound. She was listening to the first strains of her music, the first note of a long, agonizing performance, and she was the composer, the conductor, and the sole audience. The next morning, the illusion of order began to fray. The master did not come down for breakfast. He remained in his chamber, the door closed, his wife tending to him with cool cloths and whispered reassurances. The doctor was summoned, a portly man who arrived in a carriage smelling of leather and carbolic acid. He examined his patient, listened to the man's pain descriptions, and nodded sagely. His diagnosis was swift and confident: a severe case of bilious colic, an imbalance of the humors. He prescribed laudanum for the pain and a course of calomel to purge the system. The language of 19th-century medicine was designed to inspire confidence, to impose a known order onto the terrifying chaos of the body. Bile, humors, congestion, these were familiar demons. The doctor's visit calmed the household. his diagnosis a balm on their rising anxiety. But the maid knew better. She knew it wasn't an imbalance of humors. It was an imbalance of power, and she was correcting it. 2 days later, just as the master's condition seemed to ease slightly, his wife collapsed after the midday meal. The same symptoms, the same writhing intestinal agony that felt like swallowing fire. The doctor returned, looking more concerned this time. He noted it in his journal. The affliction appears to be communicable, perhaps arising from some miasma in the house or a contamination of the water. He was looking for an external enemy, a phantom in the air. He never once thought to look at the food on their plates. The psychological horror of it was just beginning to set in for the family. Illness was one thing. A shared, invisible torment was another. They started to watch each other, their eyes filled with a new kind of fear. The servants whispered in the corners of the yard. They spoke of a shadow falling over the house, a sickness that picked its victims with deliberate precision. And in the kitchen, the work continued. The bread was baked. The stews were simmered. The maid moved through the smoke and heat, her face a blank canvas. She was patient. She knew the powder she mixed into the flour was a seed, and she knew that once planted in the gut, it would grow into a garden of exquisite suffering. A whispered rumor from that time, passed down through generations of servants, claims that the maid was not born into that life. It was said she had been a free woman's daughter, literate and proud, until a debt or a betrayal forced her family into bondage. The rumor insists she never forgot what it felt like to have a name that was her own. Whether it's true or not, it speaks to the motive that history tried so hard to erase. The evidence of this motive began to appear, not in words but in stains. The laundry became a ledger of the family's decline. The bed linens, once pristine white, now told a story the doctor's notes refused to. After a night of agonizing cramps, the sheets from the master's bed would be carried down, and the laundress would see them, dark, rust-colored patches, sometimes flecks of bright red. Blood. Not the dramatic gush of a wound, but the slow, steady seepage from an internal war. The vomit in the chamber pots, once dismissed as the body purging itself of bile, now held sinister threads of crimson. This was the genius of her weapon. It mimicked the symptoms of known diseases like dysentery or ulcers, providing a plausible mask for the truth. The family, steeped in denial, and the doctor, blinded by his own medical dogma, accepted these explanations. The servants, however, knew better. They handled the bloody linens with a kind of grim reverence. They saw the pattern. The bleeding always worsened after meals. They would catch each other's eye over the washtub, the steam rising around them like a shroud, and a silent understanding would pass between them. But to speak of it, to voice the suspicion that the very food they served was the cause, that was unthinkable. It was a betrayal of their own code of silence, a code that ensured their survival. Accusation was a blade with two edges. It could just as easily cut the accuser. And so, the washing continued. The evidence was scrubbed, boiled, and bleached, but the memory of the stains remained, a faint, ghostly map of the ruin that was unfolding upstairs. The maid herself never touched the laundry. Her domain was the kitchen. She dealt in causes, not effects. She knew the blood would come. It was part of the recipe. The house began to hold its breath. The easy laughter that once filled the parlor was replaced by a heavy silence, punctuated by stifled moans from the upper floors. The children were told their parents were suffering from a summer fever, a vague and terrifying explanation that did nothing to soothe their anxiety. They moved through the halls on tiptoe, their games forgotten. They saw the fear in the eyes of the adults, and it infected them, a contagion of dread that was more potent than any physical ailment. The meals at the great dining table became tense, funereal affairs. The master and his wife, when they were well enough to come downstairs, would merely pick at their food. Their faces were drawn and pale, their bodies visibly shrinking within their fine clothes. Every bite was an act of faith they could no longer afford. They would lift a spoonful of stew to their lips, their hands trembling slightly. Was this bite safe? Would this one bring on another night of torment? Yet they continued to eat. They had to. To refuse the food would be to admit the unthinkable, that the source of their suffering was not some random sickness, but a deliberate, malicious act. It would mean acknowledging that the order of their world had been inverted, that the master was no longer safe in his own home, that the servant held the power of life and death. Their dependency was a cage. Their trust, a poison they willingly swallowed day after day. If you followed this far, you're beginning to understand the depth of this. This wasn't just about physical pain. It was a psychological dismantling. Comment, the house is breathing if you can feel the walls closing in. The maid, moving silently around the table to refill water glasses or clear plates, was no longer just a servant. She was a silent observer of her own masterpiece. She saw the hesitation in their eyes, the slight tremor in their hands. She watched as they consumed the instruments of their own destruction, their faces etched with a pain they couldn't name and a fear they wouldn't acknowledge. Her expression never changed. She was a statue of perfect servitude. But inside, a fire was burning hotter than any hearth. It was the child who broke the spell. The youngest daughter, a girl of 6 with eyes the color of a summer sky, was the first to give the horror a physical form. During the evening meal, a thin vegetable soup served in porcelain bowls, she took a spoonful and then cried out, a sharp, sudden wail. Her mother rushed to her side, thinking she'd burned her tongue. "What is it, child? What is it?" she asked, her voice tight with panic. The little girl opened her mouth, and there on her tongue, glistening in the candlelight, was a sliver of glass. It was impossibly, horribly clear. A tiny, perfect dagger stained with a bead of her own blood where it had pricked her. The sound in the room just stopped. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall seemed to thunder in the sudden, absolute silence. The father, his face a mask of disbelief, snatched the shard from the child's palm. He held it up to the candle, turning it over and over. It wasn't a pebble, it wasn't a bit of bone. It was unmistakably glass, its edges sharp and purposeful. The dam of denial that had held back a flood of terror finally broke. The mother let out a low, guttural sob. The other servants, who had been standing frozen against the walls, now seemed to shrink into the shadows. For the first time, the true nature of their enemy was visible. It wasn't a miasma, it wasn't a fever. It was in their food. It had been placed there. The immediate aftermath was chaos. The soup bowls were seized, their contents poured out and inspected. More fragments were found, winking up from the bottom of the tureen like malevolent stars. The questions began to fly, sharp and panicked. How? Who? The kitchen staff was summoned, their faces a mixture of fear and dread. They offered frantic, plausible excuses. A jar must have broken. A glass might have shattered near the stove. It was an accident. It had to be an accident. But even as they spoke the words, no one believed them. The deliberateness of the act was palpable. The shard on the child's tongue was not just a piece of glass. It was a declaration of war. A war that, until that moment, had been fought in secret, in the darkness of their own bodies. Now it was out in the open, gleaming under the candlelight. "There is no fortress against fate," wrote the Stoic philosopher Seneca. And what is a household but a fortress built of trust? When the trust is breached from within, the walls are meaningless. The discovery of the glass shifted the very atmosphere of the house from one of creeping dread to one of active, paranoid suspicion. The kitchen, once the warm, beating heart of the home, was now seen as the enemy's territory, a chamber of secrets. The family could no longer eat a single thing without imagining the grit of ground glass, the sharp prick of a hidden splinter. Every meal became a trial. Every loaf of bread was broken apart and inspected with fearful eyes. Every spoonful of soup was sifted before it was brought to the lips. But how can you find a powder ground as fine as flour? How can you spot a shard no bigger than a grain of sand? The fear was paralyzing. They were starving in a house full of food. The servants were now all under a cloud of suspicion. They were questioned, threatened, their meager belongings searched. Their movements were watched. The easy, if unequal, relationships that had governed the household were shattered. Now every interaction was fraught with tension. A dropped plate, a spilled glass, was it an accident or something more? The master, his body already weakened by the weeks of internal assault, was consumed by a helpless rage. He, who had absolute power over every soul under his roof, was being undone by an enemy he couldn't see. An act he couldn't prove was anything but a series of tragic accidents. He was a king in a castle whose own sustenance was now the ultimate threat. He was losing control, not just of his body but of his domain. And this perhaps was the cruelest part of the maid's design. She wasn't just killing them. She was forcing them to live in a state of constant, unrelenting terror. She was making them dismantle their own world, tear apart their own household in their desperate search for a phantom they had refused to see for so long. She had turned their fortress into a prison, and she was the warden, walking silently among them, her face a mask of perfect innocence. The doctor's clinical notes from this period survive, and they are chilling in their detachment. Faced with the undeniable evidence of the glass, he could no longer speak of bile and humors. His language had to adapt, but it still resisted the truth of human intent. He wrote, "Lacerations of the esophageal and gastric lining are consistent with the ingestion of sharp foreign bodies. The source of these impurities remains unknown, suggesting a lamentable lapse in kitchen hygiene." Impurities. A lapse in hygiene. He was using the sterile language of science to build a wall against a terrifying reality. He was a man of logic, of observable facts. The idea of a quiet, methodical poisoning plot, carried out by a servant, belonged to the world of Gothic novels, not the rational world of medicine. To admit it was possible would be to admit that the social order he belonged to was built on a lie. He could diagnose a torn stomach, but he could not, or would not, diagnose a hateful heart. His refusal to name the crime became a form of complicity. He prescribed bland diets, porridge, boiled milk, soft bread, believing these would be easier on the ravaged digestive tracts. He didn't understand. He was inadvertently telling the maid exactly which foods would be the most effective carriers for her finer ground powders. The family clung to his authority, to his rational explanations, because the alternative was too monstrous to contemplate. They chose to believe in a careless kitchen rather than a calculating one. They preferred the idea of a chaotic, dirty world to the idea of a single, focused point of hatred living under their own roof. The psychological horror of this is profound. Imagine knowing, on some level, that you are being murdered, but being surrounded by authority figures, doctors, family heads, who insist it's just a series of unfortunate accidents. Your own body is screaming the truth, bleeding the truth, but the world refuses to listen. You are trapped not just by the poison but by the denial. And while they debated hygiene, the maid kept grinding. The wasting began in earnest. It was a slow, agonizing erosion of life. The master was the first to become bedridden. The once powerful man was reduced to a skeletal figure, his skin stretched tight over his cheekbones, his eyes sunken and hollow. The fire in them was gone, replaced by a constant, dull flicker of pain. He could no longer keep food down, and what he did manage to swallow soon came back up, laced with blood. The laudanum kept him in a stupor, a twilight world between dream and agony, but it could not stop the relentless internal shredding. His wife was next. Her beauty, once the talk of the county, withered on the vine. Her hair grew brittle, her skin took on a gray, papery texture. She would spend her days lying on a chaise lounge in the darkened parlor, too weak to move, one hand perpetually pressed against her abdomen, as if trying to hold herself together. She would weep silently, not from the pain anymore, but from a profound and bottomless despair. The house itself seemed to be dying with them. Dust gathered on the fine furniture. The gardens became overgrown. The vibrant life of the estate dwindled to the hushed, grim routines of a sick room. The remaining children were sent away to live with relatives, a tacit admission that the house was no longer safe. The servants who remained moved like ghosts, their faces etched with fear. They knew. Of course they knew. They saw the maid, quiet and diligent as ever, preparing the broths and thin gruels that were now sent up to the master and mistress. They saw her, but they said nothing. Her silence had become a source of terrifying power. It was an invisible shield. Who would believe them over her? What proof did they have other than their own creeping certainty? She had made them all her unwilling accomplices. They served the trays, they cleaned the bloody sheets, they listened to the groans. They were cogs in her machine of vengeance, and they were trapped. Honestly, what would you have done in their place? Spoken up and risked a whipping, or worse, for an accusation you couldn't prove? Or would you have lowered your eyes and prayed the shadow didn't fall on you next? A historical footnote that casts a long shadow over this story. In the legal codes of the antebellum South, a servant's testimony against their master or a member of the family was almost always inadmissible in court. Their words had no legal weight. They were, in the eyes of the law, as silent as they were in the house. This legal erasure was a pillar of the system. It meant that whatever a servant saw, whatever they knew, it died in the air between them. The maid understood this better than anyone. It was the foundation of her plan. She was protected by the very system that enslaved her. Her invisibility was her armor. The final act for the master of the house was not a dramatic, sudden event. It was a slow, gurgling fade. The doctor's last entry reads, "Patient expired at dawn. Cause of death, catastrophic failure of the digestive organs leading to exsanguination. The wasting sickness has run its course." Wasting sickness. A name for a thing that had no name. A medical fiction to cover up a human truth. The mistress followed him 2 weeks later. Her death was quieter, a simple ceasing of breath in the middle of the night. The doctor wrote with an almost weary resignation, "The contagion has claimed another. May God have mercy on this house." But it wasn't contagion, it was persistence. It was a promise kept. After the funerals, a strange and hollow silence descended. The engine of the house had stopped. The source of the orders was gone. The surviving relatives who had come to oversee the grim proceedings were at a loss. They saw a house in mourning, a tragedy of inexplicable illness. They didn't see a crime scene. And the maid, she performed her duties with flawless, somber respect. She cooked for the funeral guests. She cleaned the empty rooms. She was the very picture of the faithful servant grieving for the family she had served so well. No one looked at her. No one suspected her. Why would they? She was just the cook. A shadow at the edge of the hearth. She had achieved a perfect, invisible victory. She had ground a family to dust, and she had done it right in front of their eyes. The final, undeniable proof came too late. It was discovered during the grim task of cleaning out the master's and mistress's chambers. A servant, emptying the contents of a chamber pot that had been overlooked in the hours after the mistress's death, noticed something at the bottom. It wasn't just the usual refuse of sickness. There was a sediment, a gritty, sparkling layer that caught the light. When she ran water into the pot, she saw them. Shards of glass. Dozens of them. Some as small as sand, others the size of a fingernail. It was the accumulated evidence of weeks of ingestion, the indigestible truth that the body had finally expelled, but only in death. This time there was no denying it. This wasn't an accident from a single meal. This was a sustained, systematic assault. The servant who found it let out a cry that brought others running. There, in the harsh light of day, was the murder weapon, undeniable and horrific. Panic erupted among the remaining staff. The thin veneer of plausible deniability was stripped away. The whispers that had been confined to the shadows now broke out into open accusations. Everyone's mind went to one place, one person. The kitchen. The quiet woman who controlled their food. They found her at the hearth, stoking the fire as if it were any other day. When they confronted her, holding up the damning evidence, accounts of what happened next diverge. They become the stuff of legend, a story told and retold until the truth is buried under layers of fear and speculation. Some say she simply looked at them, her face devoid of any emotion, and said nothing. Her silence was her final, unbreakable defense. Others say she offered a small, cold smile, a terrifying crack in the mask of servitude she had worn for years. And one version, the one whispered most often in the years that followed, claims she said just one thing. She looked at the shards in their hands, then looked at her own and said, "I served them what they deserved." You are not just watching this story. You are becoming a part of the secret. Your knowing is a form of testimony that history tried to erase. The confrontation in the kitchen was not a trial. It was an explosion. The remaining relatives, when shown the proof, bypassed any notion of law or formal justice. The legal system, after all, was for them, not for her. They were the judge, jury, and executioner, and the trial was held in the red clay of the backyard, under the shade of a massive oak tree whose branches had witnessed 100 years of the family's history. What happened under that tree is not recorded in any official document. It exists only in the fractured, contradictory oral histories of those who were there, and those who heard the stories later. One story claims she was hanged from the lowest branch of that oak, her body left to swing in the humid Georgia breeze as a warning to the others. A swift, brutal end to a slow, brutal campaign. Another, more chilling version suggests a punishment that mirrored her crime. They say they forced her to her knees and made her eat from a bowl of stew, a stew into which they had smashed a glass bottle with the heel of a boot. A direct, eye for an eye retribution, forcing her own weapon down her throat. A third story, perhaps the most haunting, is that she escaped. That in the chaos and confusion as the men argued about what was to be done, she simply vanished. Slipped out the back of the kitchen, across the fields, and into the dense, unforgiving swampland that bordered the property. In this version, she is never caught. She becomes a ghost, a legend who outsmarted them all, her ultimate fate as unknown as the full extent of her motives. Which version is the truth? Perhaps all of them, perhaps none. The lack of a clear record is the point. Her final act was to erase herself from their history, to deny them the satisfaction of a neat and tidy conclusion. She left them with a ruined house, dead masters, and a story that could never be properly finished. She became a question mark, a void, a piece of glass they could never quite remove from their memory. The past is never dead. It's not even past. William Faulkner wrote that, and he understood the nature of the American South, a place where stories and secrets seep into the soil and haunt the land for generations. The story of the maid in the glass did not end with her disappearance or death. It became a piece of folklore, a ghost story whispered by parents to frighten children into finishing their supper. The house itself became a cursed place. The surviving relatives wanted nothing to do with it. It was sold for a pittance, but no new family ever stayed for long. They spoke of a coldness in the dining room that no fire could warm. They claimed to hear the sound of grinding, like stone on stone, coming from the empty kitchen in the dead of night. They complained of a constant, phantom taste of grit in their food, no matter how carefully it was prepared. Within a decade, the house was abandoned altogether. It stood empty on its hill, a decaying monument to a secret it refused to give up. The windows, like vacant eyes, stared out over the fields. The paint peeled, the columns sagged, and the roof began to cave in. Nature reclaimed it, slowly and patiently, vines crawling up the brickwork, birds nesting in the once grand parlor. Locals called it the glass house, not because of its windows, but because of the story that was now fused to its identity. They said that on certain nights, if you were brave enough to get close, you could see a faint light in the kitchen, the ghost of a fire in a hearth long gone cold. The story outlived the people, it outlived the house, it outlived the memory of the family's name. It mutated and changed in the telling, but the core of it remained, a warning about the terrible power of the unseen and the danger of assuming that silence means consent. The maid, in the end, achieved a kind of immortality. By becoming a ghost story, she ensured that what she did, and why she did it, would never be entirely forgotten. Let's talk about the glass itself for a moment. Symbolically, it's perfect, isn't it? Glass is a paradox. It's a solid that pretends to be invisible. It creates a barrier you cannot see. It promises clarity, the ability to see through, but when broken, it becomes a weapon of almost infinite sharpness, capable of 1,000 tiny, invisible cuts. This is what she did. She took their world, a world built on the illusion of transparency and order, and she shattered it. She showed them that the very thing they looked through to see their world was the thing that would undo them. She was the invisible barrier between them and their food, the servant they looked past, never truly seeing. And by breaking that social contract, she revealed her own sharp edges. The doctor in his notes described the internal wounds as a multitude of fine incisions, 1,000 cuts, not one single fatal blow. This was not a quick murder. It was a slow, deliberate deconstruction of a human body. It was an agony designed to be prolonged, to give the victims time to contemplate their own decay. It was the physical manifestation of a psychological truth, that small, repeated cruelties, the 1,000 tiny cuts of daily humiliation and dehumanization, can accumulate into a fatal wound. She was simply returning the favor, translating their spiritual violence into a physical reality they could not ignore. Can you imagine the sheer force of will it would take to carry this out? To rise each morning, to light the fire, to knead the dough, knowing you are mixing death into it. To serve the plates, to look into the eyes of the people whose insides you are methodically destroying, and to show nothing. No anger, no pity, no triumph. Just the calm, placid mask of servitude. This was not the act of a monster. A monster is simple, its rage is hot and loud. This was the act of a philosopher of pain, an artist of vengeance. She had turned their own kitchen into a laboratory, and their bodies into the final, bloody experiment. There's a concept in psychology called annihilation anxiety. It's the primal fear not just of death, but of ceasing to exist, of being erased. For the enslaved, this was not an abstract fear. It was a daily reality. Your name, your family, your history, your very humanity could be erased at the whim of your master. You were property, a line item in a ledger. To be invisible was to be perpetually on the verge of annihilation. What if her revenge wasn't just about causing pain? What if it was about revering this annihilation? She was the one who was supposed to be ground down, turned to dust by the system. Instead, she ground down glass. She was the one who was supposed to be consumed, used up by the house. Instead, she made them consume the agent of their own destruction. It was a terrifyingly literal act of inversion. She took the central symbol of their power and comfort, the family meal, and turned it into a referendum on her own existence. With every agonizing cramp, with every drop of blood they shed, she was forcing them to acknowledge her presence. They couldn't see her, but they could damn well feel her. They were being hollowed out from the inside, becoming as empty as she was forced to be. It was a way of saying, "You will not erase me. I will erase you. I will dismantle you, organ by organ, from the inside, just as you have tried to dismantle my soul from the outside." This wasn't just murder. It was a metaphysical revolt. An act of profound, terrifying self-assertion. She was refusing to be a ghost in their story. She was forcing herself into their very blood and tissue, becoming the author of their final chapter. It's a dark thought, but it's one we have to consider. History remembers the names of the masters, the dates of the battles, the laws that were signed. It forgets the names of the cooks. But this one found a way to carve her story not into a book, but into the very lining of her oppressors' stomachs. If you've made it this far into the darkness with me, it means you're not afraid of the truths that hide in the shadows. Go ahead and hit the subscribe button and ring the bell, because we have many more forgotten rooms to unlock together. The legacy of an act like this doesn't just live in ghost stories. It ripples outwards, infecting the mundane world. For years after the story of the glass house became known, there were reports of strange anxieties in the surrounding counties. A sudden, widespread fear of bakers, a mistrust of food served at community gatherings. People began to insist on watching their meals being prepared. The simple, communal act of breaking bread together was tainted with a sliver of doubt. It was a kind of social poison, emanating from the ruins of that one house. Think about the other servants who witnessed it. They were scattered after the family's collapse, sold off, or simply drifting away. They carried the story with them. They would have told it to others in hushed tones, in new kitchens, in new households. Do you remember the woman in Georgia, the one with the glass? It became a cautionary tale, a legend within their own suppressed culture. Was it a story of triumph or a story of terror? Probably both. It was a story about a line that was crossed, a demonstration that even the most powerless person has a breaking point, and that their revenge, when it comes, can be more terrible than any master's whip. The story created a permanent crack in the foundation of trust between the server and the served, a fear that could never be fully erased. It was a reminder that the hands that bring you your plate hold an intimate power that can be used to sustain you or to utterly destroy you. The maid didn't just kill one family. She killed the idea that such a family could ever be truly safe. She weaponized the most basic human need, hunger, and turned the act of eating into a game of Russian roulette. And the echo of that gunshot, the memory of that risk, would reverberate through the culture for a long, long time. Let's shift our perspective for a moment. Let's leave the house and go into the mind of the doctor. Imagine being him. You are a man of science, of order. You believe in a universe governed by discernible rules. You diagnose, you prescribe, you heal. Your entire identity is built on the idea that you can understand and conquer the chaos of the body. Then you encounter this family. Your methods fail. Your medicines do nothing. Your theories crumble. You see symptoms that mimic known diseases but with a ferocity, a malicious precision that defies explanation. You see a husband and wife waste away and you can do nothing but document their decline in your neat clinical script. Then you see the glass, the physical proof, and in that moment your entire world must fracture. The chaos you are fighting is not random. It is not a disease. It is a plan. The force destroying this family is not a germ. It is a human will. How does a man like that process this? He can't. To accept it would be to accept that all his knowledge is useless in the face of true hatred. It would be to admit that there is a kind of sickness for which there is no cure, a poison that science cannot neutralize, the poison of the human heart. So what does he do? He retreats into the only language he has left. He calls it foreign bodies. He calls it impurities. He medicalizes it, sanitizes it, strips it of its human agency. His final notes are not the record of a doctor who has solved a mystery. They are the record of a man who has stared into an abyss and chosen to describe the shape of the rocks on the edge rather than the darkness within. His failure to name the crime was not just a failure of nerve. It was a failure of imagination. He could not conceive of a world where the cook was more powerful than the doctor, where a handful of crushed glass could defeat all of his potions and all of his knowledge. His notes are the most haunting artifact of all, because they are the testament of a man who saw the truth and deliberately, methodically, looked away. A quote from a 19th century abolitionist pamphlet reads, "Slavery is a state of war. For the enslaved, every waking moment is a battle, and every tool of the household can, in the right hands, become a weapon." We tend to think of rebellion in terms of grand, violent uprisings, but this story shows us something different. It shows us that resistance can be silent. It can be domestic. It can be patient. The kitchen was her battlefield. The pots and pans were her arsenal. The daily routine was her camouflage. This was a war of attrition, fought one meal at a time. Every morning she would rise and go to battle. She would don her armor of servitude, her apron stained with the grime of her work. She would face her enemies across the dining table, and she would attack them in the most intimate way possible, bypassing their walls, their wealth, their social standing, and going straight into their bodies. You have to appreciate the sheer audacity of it, the unshakable nerve. For months, possibly even years, she waged this secret war. She had to source her weapon, prepare it, administer it, and then watch its effects, all while maintaining a facade of absolute obedience. One mistake, one suspicious glance, one person finding a shard too early, and it would all be over. Her life would be forfeit. What kind of person can live on that knife's edge for so long? What kind of fire must be burning inside to sustain that level of focus, that depth of hatred? This is a level of psychological control and discipline that is almost superhuman. She was living a double life in the most extreme sense. In the world of the masters, she was a nonentity, a piece of domestic machinery. But in her own secret world, she was a general, a strategist, an angel of death. She had created her own parallel reality, governed by her own rules of justice. And in her reality, she was the one with all the power. Let's trace the journey of a single shard of glass. It begins as a window pane, something that separates the inside from the outside, the warmth of the house from the wildness of nature. It offers a view, a perspective. Then it is broken. It ceases to be a window and becomes a collection of sharp, useless fragments. It is discarded, forgotten, swept into a corner. It is now trash, something of no value. But then she finds it. She picks it up. In her hands, it is transformed again. It is no longer trash. It is potential. It is a weapon. She takes it to her secret place and begins to grind it. With every grating motion, she is imbuing it with her intent, her rage, her memory. She is turning an inert object into a vessel for her will. Then she mixes it into the flour, into the dough. It disappears. It becomes invisible again, hidden inside the most trusted of all foods. The bread is baked, the shard encased in warmth and softness. It is brought to the table, a Trojan horse of nourishment. It is sliced, served, and swallowed. It slides down the throat, and once inside the body in the darkness of the stomach, it is transformed one last time. It becomes a blade again. It begins its work, cutting, slicing, tearing. The very thing that was meant to sustain life now takes it piece by piece. That is the journey she orchestrated. A journey of transformation, from utility to trash, from trash to weapon, from weapon to secret, from secret to killer. It is a microscopic epic poem of revenge. She didn't just use glass. She understood its essence, its metaphorical power. She turned their own world, their own comfort, their own home back on itself. Every piece of glass was a messenger, carrying a single, silent message from her world into theirs. Nothing is what it seems. And the barrier between us is not as strong as you think. It can be broken, and when it is, it will cut you to pieces. Think about the sounds of that house in its final days. Before, it would have been filled with the sounds of life. Conversation, music from the parlor piano, children's laughter, the clatter of silverware. But as the sickness took hold, a new soundscape would have emerged. The dominant sound would have been the groans of the sick, a constant, low chorus of pain from the upper rooms. The sharp, hacking coughs that brought up blood. The frantic, whispered consultations with the doctor in the hallway. The hurried footsteps of servants carrying basins and fresh linens. But most of all, there would have been the silence. A heavy, suffocating silence in the dining room during meals. No one speaking. The only sound the scrape of a spoon against a bowl, a sound that was no longer comforting but filled with menace. Imagine sitting at that table. The food in front of you looks perfect. It smells delicious. But your body is a landscape of pain. You know that the thing causing the pain is right there on your plate, but you are trapped. You eat because you must. You eat because to not eat is to surrender. You eat because the entire structure of your life depends on this ritual of trust. And so you lift the spoon. You hear the small, almost silent sound of it entering your mouth. You swallow, and then you wait. You wait for the familiar, twisting cramps to begin. You wait for the fire to start in your gut. It is a unique and specialized form of torture, to be forced to participate, day after day, in your own murder. This is the soundscape she created. She replaced the sounds of their life with the sounds of their death, and the conductor of this symphony of dread. She moved through it all without making a sound herself. The soft padding of her bare feet on the wooden floors. The gentle way she placed a plate on the table. Her silence was the canvas upon which all the other sounds of agony were painted. A disturbing thought experiment. What if she didn't act alone? The records and the legends portray her as a solitary figure, a lone avenger. But that's the version that is simplest, easiest to comprehend. The reality of these households was a complex web of relationships, alliances, and secret resentments among the staff. What if others knew? Not the whole plan, perhaps, but fragments. What if the stable hand who saw her collecting glass behind the smokehouse chose to say nothing? What if the laundress who washed the bloody sheets understood what was happening but protected her with a wall of silence? What if this wasn't the act of one woman but a conspiracy of silence? A collective, unspoken agreement that this family, for reasons we can no longer know, had earned what was coming to them. This makes the story even darker. It suggests a whole community of the oppressed, bound together by a shared secret. They would have communicated not in words but in glances, in subtle gestures, a slight nod of the head, a hand placed briefly on an arm, a shared look of understanding over a steaming washtub. They would have formed an invisible network of complicity around her, protecting her, enabling her. She was the hand that held the knife, but they were the ones who kept the watch. This possibility changes everything. It reframes the story from a personal revenge to communal uprising, a quiet, cellular rebellion. It means the entire foundation of the house was not just cracked, it was rotten through. The masters believed they ruled over a collection of individuals. But what if they were unknowingly living on top of a secret society, a silent kingdom with its own laws, its own justice, and its own brutal methods of enforcement? We will never know for sure. But the possibility hangs in the air, as sharp and as unsettling as a shard of glass in the dark. If you are still here listening, it is because some part of you recognizes the truth in this story. Not the historical facts, but the emotional truth. The truth about power, about silence, and about the darkness that can grow in the forgotten corners of the world. Comment silence is a weapon below if you understand. Now, let us consider the children. There were children in this house. The story is remembered for the death of the masters, but the children were also victims. The little girl with the shard on her tongue. Her brothers and sisters who were sent away. What happened to them? They survived physically, but what kind of psychological scars would they carry? They would have grown up with a deep primal mistrust of the world, a fear of food, a suspicion of caregivers, the most basic sources of comfort and security, a warm meal, a mother's care, would be forever linked in their minds with terror, pain, and death. They would have seen their parents, the pillars of their world, waste away and die in agony. They would have lived in a house saturated with fear. How does a child process that? They would carry that house inside them for the rest of their lives, a haunted house in the architecture of their own minds. This is the collateral damage of her war, the innocent bystanders caught in the crossfire. Does this make her a monster? Does it negate the justice, however brutal, of her act against the masters? This is where the story becomes truly uncomfortable. It refuses to give us a simple hero or a simple villain. It presents us with a cycle of violence where the abused becomes the abuser and the pain is passed down to the next generation. The maid was, in all likelihood, a victim of unimaginable cruelty herself. But in her quest for retribution, she created new victims. It's a terrible, tangled knot that can never be undone. The story is not just about a maid's revenge. It's about the way that trauma echoes, the way that violence begets violence, leaving a trail of broken lives in its wake, spreading outwards from the epicenter of that one silent kitchen. There is a concept in warfare known as asymmetric warfare. It's when a weaker, less equipped force uses unconventional tactics to fight a stronger, more powerful enemy. They don't engage in direct head-to-head combat. They use sabotage, guerrilla tactics, psychological operations. They attack the enemy's infrastructure, their morale, their sense of security. This is exactly what the Maid did. She was a master of asymmetric warfare. Her enemy had all the power, all the weapons, the law, the money, the social structure. She had the kitchen. So she turned the kitchen into her weapon. She didn't need a gun or a sword. She used what she had: access, trust, and patience. Her primary tactic was psychological. She didn't just want to kill them. She wanted to terrify them. She wanted to dismantle their minds before she dismantled their bodies. By making the source of the danger their own food, she made them complicit in their own demise. Every meal was a test of their will, a choice between starvation and a painful death. She attacked their morale by turning their home into a house of horrors. The place that was meant to be their sanctuary became their prison. She attacked their infrastructure by destroying the family unit from within, killing the patriarch and matriarch and scattering the children. It was a brilliant, terrifyingly effective military campaign, executed by a single, unarmed soldier operating deep in enemy territory. We call it a story of revenge, but it's also a story of war. A forgotten war fought not in the fields of Gettysburg, but in the dining rooms of the South. A war of one. And in this particular war, against all odds, the lone, outgunned soldier won a devastating and absolute victory. She didn't just defeat her enemy. She annihilated them. She erased them from their own house, from their own land, leaving nothing behind but a ghost story and a decaying ruin. Let's consider the final confrontation again under the oak tree. Let's assume the version where they force-feed her the glass is true. Imagine that scene, the raw, primal fury of the survivors. They are no longer the civilized, genteel planter class. They are reduced to something much more basic, a pack cornering the creature that has hunted them. Their masks of civility have been shattered. She has forced them to become as savage as they always accused her of being. And what of her in that moment? Does she fight? Does she scream? Or does she accept it with that same unnerving silence? Perhaps in a final, terrible act of defiance, she eats it willingly. She looks them in the eye as she swallows the shards, embracing the same fate she delivered to them. A final, silent statement. I am not afraid of the weapon you stole from me. The pain you inflict on my body is nothing compared to the pain I have inflicted on your souls. You can kill me, but I have already won. I have destroyed your name. I have ended your line. I have turned your house into a tomb. My work is done. In this scenario, her death is not a defeat. It is a coronation. It is the final bloody seal on her victory. They think they are enacting justice, but they are merely fulfilling her prophecy. They are completing the cycle of violence that she began. She has not only been their executioner, she has become their teacher. She has taught them the language of intimate brutality. And by killing her in this way, they are showing her that they have learned the lesson all too well. This is the deepest horror of the story. She didn't just destroy them, she transformed them. She held up a mirror made of broken glass, and in it, she forced them to see their own monstrous reflection. Let's pull back from the story itself and look at the frame. You and I here now. Why are we so drawn to a story like this? It's over 150 years old. It's about people and a world that are utterly alien to us. And yet it resonates. It strikes a chord deep inside. I think it's because this story speaks to a fundamental primal fear, the fear of betrayal from within. The fear that the things we trust the most, our food, our homes, the people who serve us, can turn against us. It's the ultimate Trojan horse narrative. The danger isn't at the gates, it's already inside, sitting at our table, smiling at us. This story strips away all the complexities of modern life and boils things down to the essentials: life, death, trust, and betrayal. It reminds us that for all our technology, for all our progress, we are still vulnerable at the most basic level. We all have to eat. We all have to trust the hands that prepare our food. This story is a dark fable for our times, just as it was for its own. It's a warning about the dangers of dehumanization. It shows what can happen when you treat a person as an object, a function, a tool. You forget that the tool has a mind. You forget that the object has a soul. And you forget that the soul might be nurturing a rage so vast and so patient that it can wait for years to have its revenge. We look back on this story with a kind of horrified fascination, but maybe we should also look at it with a sense of recognition. The dynamics of power and powerlessness, of visibility and invisibility, of silent rage and explosive vengeance, these are not confined to the 19th century South. They are part of the human condition. And this maid, this nameless, faceless woman of glass, is an archetype. She is the ghost of everyone who has ever been silenced, ignored, and underestimated. And her story is a timeless, terrifying reminder of what happens when the silent decide to speak, not with words but with fire, and with glass. What became of the land itself? The fields that had been the source of the family's wealth. After the house was abandoned, the land went fallow. The neat rows of cotton were reclaimed by weeds and wildflowers. The fences rotted and fell. Nature, it seems, has no patience for human drama. It simply erases it. Local legend says that for generations, that specific plot of land was considered bad soil. Farmers who tried to cultivate it found their crops failed. They said the ground was poisoned, soured by the tragedy that had happened there. They spoke of finding small, glittering fragments in the soil when they tilled, like the earth was sweating out the memory of the glass. Of course, this is just folklore, but it speaks to a deeper truth. The land is a witness. It holds the memory of what happens on it. The blood and the tears, the sweat and the rage, they don't just wash away. They seep into the ground. They become part of the story of the place. Today, if you were to go there, you would find nothing. A highway might run through it. A suburban development might cover it. The oak tree is long gone. The foundation of the house is buried under tons of earth. There is no marker, no plaque, no sign that anything ever happened there. It has been utterly and completely erased from the physical world. And yet the story survives. It has outlasted the bricks, the wood, the people, the land itself. It has become a disembodied narrative, a piece of cultural DNA passed down from one generation to the next, which proves that you can tear down a house, you can plow over a field, you can bury the bones, but you cannot kill a story. A story, once told, takes on a life of its own. It becomes a ghost. And this particular ghost, the ghost of a silent cook in a Georgia kitchen, still walks. It walks through our history, a quiet, unsettling reminder that the most terrifying secrets are the ones that are hidden in plain sight. a disturbing final detail taken from a letter written by a neighbor decades after the event. The author is an old woman recalling her childhood memories of the glass house. She writes, "My father told me that after the family was gone and the house stood empty, the strangest thing would happen. The bread oven in the old kitchen would sometimes be found warm in the mornings, as if a fire had been lit in the night. There was never any smoke from the chimney, never any sign of a person. Just a faint, residual warmth in the bricks. He said it was her, still baking." This image is pure Gothic horror, but it's also profoundly symbolic. The hearth, the oven, was the center of her power, the altar upon which she prepared her terrible sacrifices. The idea that she would return to it in death to continue her work is a testament to the sheer, obsessive force of her will. She wasn't just seeking revenge. She was fulfilling a purpose. Baking was her craft, her identity. She simply changed one of the ingredients. The warmth in the oven is the warmth of her rage, a fire that could not be extinguished even by death. It suggests that her mission was never truly finished, that her hatred was so pure and so vast, it became a permanent feature of the landscape, a supernatural phenomenon. It's a chilling thought, that some human emotions are so powerful they can leave an imprint on the physical world, a psychic stain. An echo of an action that continues to reverberate long after the actor is gone. The empty house, the phantom baker, the warm oven, it's the perfect closing chapter for her story. She has transcended her own life and death. She is no longer a person. She is a presence, a genius loci, the spirit of the place. The silent, eternal cook, forever baking her bread of sorrows in a kitchen that no longer exists. So where does this leave us? We have followed a trail of whispers, of bloody linens, of doctors' notes and ghost stories. We have descended into the heart of a great American horror story. We have seen how a system of absolute power creates the conditions for an absolute revenge. We have seen how silence can be forged into a weapon sharper than any knife. We have seen how the most mundane and comforting of rituals, the family meal, can be transformed into an engine of terror and death. But we are still left with the central mystery, her, the maid. We have given her motives, we have analyzed her methods, we have marveled at her psychological fortitude, but we still don't know who she was. We don't know her name. We don't know her face. We don't know her story before she came to that house. She remains a ghost, an absence at the center of the storm she created. And maybe that's the point. Maybe she is more powerful as a symbol than she ever could be as a person. By remaining anonymous, she becomes universal. She is not one woman. She is every woman, every person who has been pushed to the edge and decided to push back. She is the embodiment of the rage that simmers beneath the surface of a placid, orderly world. Her story is a testament to the fact that you can own a person's body, you can own their labor, you can erase their name from your records, but you can never truly own their mind. And the mind is where the seeds of rebellion are planted. The mind is the one place that can never be fully conquered. The mind is the kitchen where the recipes for revenge are perfected. She may have been a slave in their world, but in the landscape of our darkest fears and most forbidden fantasies of justice, she will forever be a queen. Let's contemplate the table itself. The grand mahogany dining table that stood at the center of their world. Before the tragedy, it was a symbol of everything they held dear. Family, tradition, prosperity, stability. It was where they gathered to celebrate births, to mourn deaths, to conduct business, to forge alliances. The surface, polished to a mirror shine, reflected their own smiling, confident faces back at them. It was the altar of their domestic religion. She desecrated that altar. She turned it from a place of communion into a place of execution. The food she placed upon it was no longer a sacrament, it was a poison. The ritual of breaking bread was no longer an act of unity, it was an act of destruction. After the deaths, the table became a cursed object. As the legend says, no one could eat at it again without feeling a profound uneasiness. The wood itself seemed to have absorbed the memory of the horror. It was no longer just a piece of furniture, it was a tombstone. A silent, polished witness to the family's agonizing end. When the house was finally abandoned, the table was left behind. It sat in the dark, gathering dust, the centerpiece of a dead world. It is the perfect metaphor for the entire story. A beautiful, well-crafted surface hiding a rotten core. a symbol of civilized order that becomes the stage for a savage, primal act of vengeance. The story isn't just about the maid or the glass or the family. It's about the collapse of a world. And the epicenter of that collapse, the ground zero of the explosion, was that one, polished and now eternally haunted mahogany table. It stood there in the ruins, a monument to the simple, terrifying truth that the difference between a feast and a funeral is sometimes just one, single, invisible ingredient. The final irony of this whole affair is the nature of her weapon, glass. It's made from sand, one of the most common and humble materials on Earth. It's made by subjecting that sand to an intense, purifying fire. She too was a common, humble person in their eyes, as insignificant as a grain of sand. But she had been subjected to the intense, purifying fire of her own rage, her own suffering. And that fire had transformed her. It had made her hard, sharp, and transparent in her purpose. She took the stuff of the earth, the very dust they walked upon, and she turned it into the instrument of their downfall. There is a terrible elemental poetry to it. It's a story of alchemy, the alchemy of rage, the ability to take pain and oppression and transform it into a focused, deadly, and effective weapon. She didn't have access to poisons from an apothecary. She didn't have a knife or a gun. She had to create her weapon from the scraps of their world, from their broken, discarded things. And in doing so, she created something far more terrifying. A poison that wasn't really a poison. A weapon that was invisible. A method of murder that looked, for the longest time, like simple, tragic fate. It is a testament to the terrifying ingenuity of the human mind when it is pushed to its absolute limit. When you strip a person of everything, their freedom, their dignity, their name, you do not necessarily break them. Sometimes, you burn away everything but the essential core of their will. And that core, like glass forged in a furnace, can become something both beautiful and terrifyingly sharp, something capable of cutting through anything, even the foundations of a house that was built to last forever. In the end, what are we left with? Not a history, but a haunting, a story that resists easy answers and tidy moral conclusions. We are left with fragments just like the shards of glass. Fragments of evidence, fragments of memory, fragments of a truth that can never be fully reassembled. The house is gone. The family is gone. The maid is a ghost, a name that was never even known. All that remains is the act itself, a perfect circle of violence, so self-contained and so devastating that it continues to mesmerize us across the centuries. It is a story about the ultimate failure of power. The masters had every advantage, every protection that society could offer, but they could not protect themselves from the contents of their own stomachs. They could not legislate against a hateful thought. They could not build a wall high enough to keep out a vengeance that was already living in their kitchen. The story serves as a permanent, chilling reminder, a warning that is etched in blood and glass. It says that true power is not always loud and visible. Sometimes it is silent. Sometimes it is patient. And sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one that nobody is watching. She served them their last meal on a cold autumn evening. It was a simple broth. They were too weak for anything else. As she placed the bowls on their bedside tables, her face was, as always, a perfect mask of quiet servitude. This was her final act of mercy. The broth contained nothing but broth. Their torment was over. She had already won. She walked out of the kitchen, untied her apron, and left it folded neatly on the wooden table. Then she stepped out into the twilight and vanished from the pages of history forever, leaving behind nothing but a house full of ghosts and a story that would never die. This whole story, whether myth or a half-remembered truth, is a brutal lesson in human psychology. It demonstrates that the need for justice, for recognition, is a force as fundamental as hunger itself. When people are utterly dehumanized, when their existence is denied, they sometimes find terrifying ways to prove that they are real. The maid's revenge wasn't just about inflicting pain. It was a desperate, horrific act of communication. It was her way of screaming her own name into a world that refused to hear it. What do you think was her true motive? Was it pure hatred, a cold desire for justice, or something else entirely, something we can no longer even comprehend. Let me know your theories in the comments below. And if these descents into the forgotten corners of history are what you seek, subscribe to this channel. Turn on notifications. The darkest truths are always the ones that were buried the deepest, and together we will keep digging.